In the winter of 1838, when the Mississippi River breathed fog like a sleeping animal and the cotton fields lay bare, under a gray and unsettled sky, Jacob's story began long before anyone knew his name beyond the worn ledgers of the plantation that claimed ownership over his existence. He had been born on the Thompson estate, a vast stretch of land carved from stolen indigenous territory, its fields fed by enslaved hands and its profits carried north on flatboats that cut through the river's steady current. Jacob's mother, Lena, had once whispered to him stories of a free town upriver, a place where people with skin the color of theirs walked without fear, where no overseers followed their steps, where labor was chosen, not forced. Those stories, spoken in hushed breaths inside a dark cabin lit only by the dying glow of a pine knot, became the kindling for the idea that would shape Jacob's life. The plantation tried to crush such ideas quickly, for hope was too dangerous a seed. But some seeds root underground where no one can see their growth. By the time Jacob reached his 20s, he had grown into a man whose silence concealed the storms inside him. A man whose steady hands and calm gaze made overseers think he was compliant, even grateful. They never imagined that behind that quiet demeanor lay a memory of a mother dragged away after being accused of teaching others to read, or that he still carried her final message, the one she whispered as she was taken, "Find the river." Jacob, it remembers how to carry people home. Jacob worked on the docks more often than in the fields, a placement that overseers believed would keep him from the rebellious spirit they associated with the strong-willed men who labored in rows of cotton. But the docks gave him something far more valuable: eyes on the river traffic, knowledge of boat schedules, the way cargo was loaded and tied, the sound of chains on the storage doors, the routes that flatboats and keelboats took depending on the season, and the faces of the occasional abolitionist masquerading as a merchant. He learned to read the river's moods, how it swelled when the northern snowmelt rushed down, how its currents curled near the banks, how fog could hide a vessel so completely that even a lantern held 3 feet away appeared as a faint halo. He learned which stretches of the river were patrolled by slave catchers, and which bends were so quiet that even the sound of a paddle striking water could echo like a warning. What overseers saw as a simple labor assignment became Jacob's education, a silent apprenticeship in escape routes and freedom strategies that no schoolhouse in the country would have been permitted to offer him. Each day, as he tied ropes and rolled cargo barrels and watched boats drift out of sight, the river spoke to him in a language of possibility, telling him that captivity was not the end of his story, but escape was not merely an idea. It was a living risk pulsing through every conversation held in whispers, every stolen moment in the quarters, every glance cast over his shoulder. Punishments for even discussing escape were brutal, often fatal, and the memory of those punishments hung heavy in the air like humidity before a storm. People had been mutilated, sold away, hunted with dogs, or paraded as warnings through nearby plantations. Families lived with the constant fear that any wrong step could lead to separation, and yet hope continued to move through them quietly, like water finding its way through cracks. Jacob understood better than most that any plan he made could cost him and others their lives. He had no intention of acting rashly, no fantasies of heroic single-handed rebellion. Instead, he watched, listened, observed patterns, and waited for the kind of moment that history seldom grants, but the desperate must seize. When it appears, that moment began to take shape when Jacob met Ruth, a woman recently sold from an estate in Louisiana after her husband had been killed during a failed escape attempt. Ruth carried grief like a shadow, but also a clarity that came from having seen the worst of what the world could do. She spoke little, trusted few, kept her eyes down in the presence of overseers, but she noticed everything. Jacob recognized in her the same controlled quiet that lived within himself, a quiet born not from surrender, but from strategic endurance. Over weeks, without ever speaking of it openly, they began to understand that they shared a secret yearning. They would stand near each other during work at the docks, never too close to invite suspicion, but close enough that Jacob could see how her eyes followed the boats, just as his had done for years. If hope had been a forbidden flame, then Ruth's presence was the wind that made Jacob's smoldering ember glow brighter. The first spark of their plan emerged not from bold revelation, but from an accidental opportunity. A storm upriver had delayed several shipments, causing congestion on the docks and creating an unusual amount of confusion among the white supervisors. During one of these chaotic mornings, Jacob noticed a flatboat moored unusually close to the shore, its cargo loosely tied and its pilot distracted by negotiations with a merchant. The boat's proximity to a cluster of storage sheds created a sheltered path, where shadows pulled thickly. Jacob realized then that the river could conceal, not just carry. After that day, he began intentionally seeking the moments when the natural rhythms of trade created blind spots. He learned when the dock patrols rotated, which supervisors drank enough whiskey to stagger by noon, and which merchants hired free black laborers who might secretly sympathize with the enslaved. It was never just one detail, but a constellation of them forming slowly, until Jacob understood that the river, with all its danger and promise, could become a corridor of liberation. As he gathered knowledge, Jacob also measured people, their fears, their loyalties, their willingness to trust. Not everyone wanted to escape. Not everyone could. Age, injuries, children, loved ones on other plantations, every individual's circumstances shaped their decisions. Jacob refused to pressure anyone, for he had seen too many men fail because they mistook desperation for readiness. Instead, he quietly observed who was already looking toward the horizon, who lingered near the docks longer than necessary, who traced maps in the dirt with their fingers during late-night conversations. He listened for questions disguised as casual remarks, for the trembling edge in a voice when someone joked about freedom. These were the clues that guided him. Slowly, he found a small circle of people whose lives had been hardened by enough pain that fear no longer outweighed hope. Ruth was among them. So was Samuel, whose brother had been sold south. Clara, who was no more than 16, but bore scars from an overseer's whip that she refused to let define her, and an older man named Moses, who had survived so much loss that the idea of dying on the river felt no different to him than dying in the fields, except that on the river, death might meet him with dignity rather than chains. As the circle grew, so did the complexity of the plan. Jacob knew that escaping one person was difficult. Escaping dozens was an act that bordered on the impossible. Yet the plantation system itself contained weaknesses that few white planters recognized. They believed that enslaved people were incapable of organized planning, incapable of understanding geography or timing or strategic thinking. They believed that fear erased intelligence. Jacob intended to use that blindness against them. He understood that the most effective escape would not be a rushed flight in the dark, but a meticulously orchestrated operation disguised by the daily monotony the enslavers took for granted. He studied the schedules of cotton transports and noticed that every 2 weeks, a shipment larger than usual departed for a buyer's hub upriver. Those vessels were always heavily loaded, their decks stacked high, their pilots diverted by inventory lists and price negotiations. A heavily loaded boat traveled slower and required more crew attention, creating moments when no one monitored the lower deck. Jacob realized that if a group could conceal themselves deep among the cargo, the boat might carry them unnoticed out of Mississippi entirely. To achieve such a feat required precision and trust on a level few dared to imagine. Tools had to be hidden, routes memorized, signals agreed upon, and timing coordinated to the second. Ruth, with her knowledge of sewing and repair work, began discreetly collecting canvas scraps that could be used to create pockets within the cargo piles. Samuel found a way to divert metal scraps from the blacksmith's area to fashion small tools for loosening boards. Clara learned to forge work process from watching an illiterate overseer sign his name with the same sloppy gesture each time. Moses kept watch during nighttime meetings and collected stories from travelers on nearby plantations about patrol patterns along the river bank. Everything they gathered was done under constant threat. A misplaced scrap of canvas, a found tool, a whisper overheard by the wrong person, any of it could bring the entire plan crashing down, ending in death for all involved. Despite the risks, something remarkable began to take shape in the quarters, a sense of shared determination that had not been felt in years. People began to walk with a little more steadiness, their eyes holding a flicker of resolve. They still carried water and chopped wood and bent over fields, but beneath the layers of exhaustion lived a quiet electricity. The possibility of freedom, even the faintest sliver, shaped how they breathed. Yet they also understood the gravity of what they were attempting. If even one person faltered, if fear overcame resolve at the wrong moment, if a guard grew suspicious, if weather betrayed them, all could be lost. They prayed not for miracles, but for strength, clarity, and the courage to carry out what history might never record. As winter deepened, Jacob felt the river changing. The nights grew colder, the fog thicker, the sound of water against the pilings deeper and more resonant. He sensed that the season of action was approaching. The larger cotton shipment was scheduled for late February, a time when icy winds made patrols lazier. and river traffic unpredictable. The plan would hinge on that shipment. It had to. There would be no second chance. Jacob walked the docks each day with the air of a man absorbed in his tasks, but inside, every movement was part of a countdown. Each creaking rope, each shifting crate, each shout from a foreman became part of the intricate tapestry he was weaving. He felt the presence of his mother in every moment, her words echoing across the years. Find the river. It remembers. By the night before the plan was set in motion, Jacob knew that the path ahead would not guarantee survival. Freedom was not promised. The river could swallow them, patrols could intercept them, betrayal could surface from unexpected places. But he also knew that staying meant slow death, a death in chains, a death in silence, a death without meaning. As he lay awake in the cramped darkness of the quarters, listening to the steady breathing of his companions, Jacob felt the magnitude of what they were about to do. They were not simply escaping. They were reclaiming something stolen across generations. They were preparing to carve a passage through a world that had been built to contain them. And in the stillness of that night, with the river murmuring beyond the trees, Jacob realized that the journey ahead would demand everything he had ever been taught to suppress: courage, leadership, strategy, and faith in a world that had given them little reason to trust it. Yet he also understood that sometimes the most powerful stories are born where fear meets resolve, and where a single choice can change not just one life, but dozens. By the time dawn crept over the horizon the next day, painting the Mississippi River in faint streaks of copper and gray, Jacob had already been awake for hours, going over every detail of the plan in his mind with the precision of someone who understood that survival depended on flawless execution. The quarter doors opened before sunrise, as they always did, the overseer's boots striking the ground, like a drum announcing the beginning of another day of labor. But for Jacob and the others involved in the escape, the sound felt different, sharper, heavier, carrying a weight that pressed against their ribs. Each step they took that morning had to resemble routine. Every expression had to remain neutral, every gesture ordinary, every breath controlled. The world around them could not know that this day marked the beginning of a journey that might never be completed, a journey that held the power to fracture the bondage of dozens of enslaved souls who had prayed for deliverance for so long that the dream itself sometimes felt like a dangerous delusion. Jacob knew that the first challenge of escape was not the river or the guards or the unpredictable currents of fate. It was maintaining the illusion that nothing unusual was happening and all died. As Jacob walked toward the docks, carrying heavy coiled rope over his shoulder, he studied each familiar face he passed. Some eyes flicked toward him with the faintest spark of awareness, but most looked away quickly, not wanting even the appearance of involvement. In slavery, secrets were not just matters of trust, but matters of survival. People learned to avoid knowing things that could get them killed. Yet, beneath that instinctive caution, Jacob sensed something else: a collective tightening of breath, a suspended tension that radiated through the quarters like a pulse. Even those who had not chosen to join the escape felt the change in the air. They knew that something was moving beneath the surface of plantation life, something dangerous and fragile and necessary, and though they might never speak of it, their quiet prayers blended into the wind that blew across the fields. The riverfront was already bustling with activity by the time Jacob arrived. Men hauled crates stacked with gin cotton, barrels of pork salted for transport, and bundles of hemp rope that would be used to secure the cargo on the flatboat destined for the upriver hub. Overseers barked orders, dogs sniffed along the shoreline, and the pilot of the boat, a weary, impatient man known among the enslaved workers for his disdain, stood tapping his foot. As he reviewed an inventory sheet, Jacob felt the familiar surge of unease as he stepped into this chaotic environment, not because of the work itself, but because he knew that everything they planned depended on the predictable patterns. Inside this seemingly disordered setting, the flatboat was massive, loaded with more than 20 bales of cotton stacked in high tiers, crates of tools, and bundles of raw goods from the Thompson estate. Its lower deck, dimly lit by slivers of daylight filtering between the planks, held additional storage compartments where smaller items were kept locked behind wooden doors, reinforced with thick nails. It was inside this lower deck that Jacob had identified potential hiding spaces: narrow, air-starved cavities between cargo stacks where a human body could fit, only by contorting itself into painful angles. It would not be comfortable, safe, or guaranteed, but it could be invisible, and invisibility was freedom's first shield. Jacob moved through his tasks with the same deliberate calm he had practiced for years. He adjusted stacks, tied knots, secured tarps, and helped load barrels into the lower deck. but every movement had hidden intention. When he pressed his palm against a wooden panel, he was testing it for looseness. When he shifted a crate, he was widening the shadow gap by half an inch. When he tightened the ropes on the upper deck, he was memorizing the angle at which the shadows would fall at dusk. No one watching him could see the pattern in what he was doing, but for Jacob, each task was part of an invisible choreography that must align perfectly by nightfall. The others joined the effort throughout the day. Ruth worked under the pretense of assisting with canvas repairs on the dock scaffolding, slipping small pockets of cloth into hidden places among the cargo. Each pocket held small essentials, a few dried berries, a water-soaked cloth that could be wrung out for moisture, a piece of rope thin enough to be concealed but strong enough to serve as a lifeline. Samuel stayed near the blacksmith's shed, forging replacement nails that could be subtly removed later to create temporary entrances into the hiding spaces. He wiped sweat from his brow with movements that seemed casual, but were in fact deliberate signals to Jacob when overseers were approaching. Clara remained near the plantation offices, studying the overseers' routines and passing quiet glances toward the river. Whenever the path was clear, Moses moved through the shadows of the quarter yard, speaking softly to those who had chosen to join, reminding them of the timing: sunset, then full darkness, then the moment when the last lantern on the dock flickered low enough that the guard's eyes grew heavy. It was a plan dependent on the sleepiness of tired men, the rhythm of work-worn lives, and the complacency of a system that believed its victims broken. But as with any plan, uncertainty coiled itself into every corner. Jacob felt it tightening around him with each hour that passed. The river had risen slightly overnight, sending a faint but noticeable pull through the currents that lapped against the pilings. If the water level rose too much, the boat might shift, blocking access to the lower deck entrances they intended to use, and storm clouds to the west hinted that the evening might bring rain. Something that could work in their favor by reducing visibility, or against them by drawing more guards to the docks to ensure nothing went missing in the weather. Jacob studied the sky repeatedly, his chest tightening with each passing cloud. He knew that nature had its own will, one that could not be negotiated or planned around, but the river had always been unpredictable. Freedom was never won on calm water. By noon, tension had seeped into Jacob's muscles so deeply that his movements felt weighted. He took a moment to kneel near the river's edge, pretending to tie off a rope, and dipped his fingers into the cold water. The chill ran up his arm, anchoring him to the reality of the present moment. He remembered the stories his mother had told him about rivers being pathways not just for bodies, but for spirits. She had said that water carried memory across generations, that it held the wounds and hopes of those who lived along its banks. As the icy current slid across his skin, Jacob wondered if the river remembered all who had tried to cross it in chains or in secret. He wondered if it carried the names of those who had been caught, drowned, or dragged back. And he wondered if it would carry the names of those who succeeded, whispering their stories through the reeds for years to come. He closed his eyes briefly, letting the cold steady him, then returned to work with renewed determination. Later that afternoon, a minor incident threatened to unravel the entire plan. A young boy named Elias, barely 12, tripped while carrying a bundle of rope and fell hard against one of the cargo crates, knocking it over. The crash sounded louder than a gunshot in the tense air. Overseers rushed over, barking questions, suspicion immediate in their eyes. Jacob's heart pounded as he watched Elias stammer apologies, terrified. The crate's contents spilled across the deck: canvas scraps, rope, and tools. It was enough to raise dangerous questions if anyone paid closer attention. Before the overseers could look too closely, Ruth stepped forward, claiming responsibility by explaining that she had left the crate unsecured while repairing another sail. Her voice was steady, her face carefully disinterested, masking the fear that Jacob knew burned inside her. The overseer lashed out, striking her across the cheek with the back of his hand. More out of frustration than doubt, the blow echoed against the river. When it had done its job, his attention shifted from suspicion to anger, and he ordered everyone back to work. Jacob clenched his fists, but forced himself to remain still. He could not risk reacting. The plan depended on silence, on discipline, on swallowing rage until they reached a place where they could release it freely. As the afternoon faded into evening, the light softened into amber hues that stretched long shadows across the docks. The pale skies darkened gradually, and the sounds of the plantation shifted. The clatter of tools quieted. The hum of workers returning to the quarters grew louder, and the overseers' conversations turned toward supper and whiskey and the warmth of their fires. This shifting of daily rhythms was the opening the escape depended on. Under the cover of dusk, when exhaustion softened the vigilance of the guards, Jacob and the others would slip through the invisible fractures in the plantation's routines. But even as the sun dipped below the tree line, Jacob knew they could not move too soon. The moment had to feel natural, unforced, unnoticed. A premature shift in movement could draw watchful eyes. When the final crates were secured on the flatboat, and the pilot announced he would depart at first light, Jacob felt his chest tighten with a mixture of dread and anticipation. The boat would be guarded through the night, but not heavily. Historically, guards relied on chain cargo locks and a steep angle of the lower deck to deter tampering. Their belief that enslaved people lacked the skill or bravery to infiltrate a cargo hold was the very arrogance Jacob intended to exploit. He had timed the escape to coincide with the moment when the guards' lanterns burned low, and their conversations drifted into idle boredom, that dangerous lull where men made mistakes. But timing alone was not enough. What they were attempting required stillness, patience, and absolute silence once they were inside the hold. A single cough could mean discovery. A misstep could end the journey before it began. Jacob reminded himself of this as he watched Clara, Samuel, Ruth, and Moses blend into the workers returning to the quarters. Their bodies relaxed outwardly, but tense beneath the surface. The quarters themselves buzzed with a subdued electricity. Those who were participating in the escape gathered near the back cabins, pretending to sort laundry or gather firewood, while quietly exchanging final glances of understanding. Those who were not participating sat silently, their faces solemn, knowing that by sunrise the plantation might be thrown into chaos. Not one soul uttered a word about the escape directly. Fear sealed lips more effectively than promises ever could. But within the stillness, Jacob could feel a collective heartbeat pulsing through the walls, a mixture of dread, hope, grief, and pride. These were people who had spent lifetimes being controlled, watched, punished, and silenced. Tonight, they would defy all of it. The enormity of that truth weighed heavily on Jacob's shoulders as he sat in the corner of the quarters with Ruth beside him, her cheeks still bruised from the overseer's blow. She leaned her head against the wall and closed her eyes for a moment. Jacob watched her chest rise and fall slowly, knowing that soon even breathing would become a challenge when they were confined in the cargo hold. He wondered if this would be the last quiet moment they would ever share. As darkness fully descended, the plantation sank into a deceptive calm. Lanterns flickered in the distance, their orange glow faint through the trees. Dogs barked intermittently near the big house, but the docks were quieter. The guards had retreated into their small shelter near the boat, where a single lantern cast a dim circle of light around them. Jacob knew the time had come. One by one, those joining the escape slipped from the quarters, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the patches of moonlight where their movements could draw attention. They moved with the cautious precision of people walking between life and death. The closer they approached the river, the louder the water seemed to grow, as if the Mississippi were calling them, urging them forward or warning them back. It was impossible to tell. Jacob led the group, his eyes adjusting quickly to the darkness. He had memorized every step of the route, every tree root that rose from the ground, every uneven patch of soil, every angle of approach that kept them hidden from the guards' line of sight. When they reached the final stretch of shadow that hugged the side of the dock, Jacob paused and signaled silently. The group formed tightly behind him, breaths shallow, hearts pounding. A gust of wind swept across the river, rattling loose cords and tugging at the boat's canvas covering with a haunting whisper. Jacob waited for the guards' attention to drift, for their lantern flame to flicker just enough, for their posture to slacken. Every second felt like an hour. Then, at last, the moment arrived. The guards rose briefly to stretch. Turning their backs toward the lower deck entrance, Jacob moved first, slipping across the narrow opening between the dock and the boat with a fluid motion that made him nearly invisible in the shadows. The others followed one by one, silent as nightfall. The air inside the lower deck was thick with the smell of wood, damp canvas, and the faint tang of river rot. It was oppressively dark, the kind of darkness that swallowed shape and dissolved distance. Jacob guided each person into their designated hiding space, helping them contort their bodies into the cramped cavities carved between crates and cotton bales. Soft breaths trembled in the air, the only sound allowed. The boat rocked gently, each movement a reminder of how unforgiving the river could be. When the last person was hidden, Jacob pressed his palm against the wooden panel they would rely on to keep them concealed. Feeling the grain beneath his fingers like a living pulse, he allowed himself one final glance toward the narrow sliver of darkness that led back to the shore. Then he slipped into his own hiding place, pulling the panel into place and letting the darkness swallow him whole. The darkness inside the cargo hold became absolute once Jacob settled into his hiding place, sealing the wooden panel behind him until not even the faintest shard of moonlight could slip through. The air grew tighter, as if pressed inward by the weight of the river itself. For a moment, Jacob felt the instinctive surge of panic that came whenever the body believed it was trapped, but he forced his breathing into long, quiet exhales, letting his mind adjust to the claustrophobic confines. His arms were pinned against his chest, his knees wedged tightly against the curve of the crate, and his cheek pressed against rough wood that scraped the skin every time he shifted. But discomfort was nothing new, and fear was an old companion. He reminded himself that this confinement was a door disguised as a prison. If he endured it long enough, it would open into a world beyond chains, beyond overseers, beyond the relentless weight of bondage. As his heartbeat steadied, the sounds of the night filtered faintly through the cracks, the muffled murmur of guards' voices on the dock, the splash of water against the hull, the hum of insects along the river bank. All of it blended into a rhythm that marked the beginning of the most dangerous night of their lives. Silence settled over the hold as the others adjusted into their hiding spaces. Jacob could not see them, but he could sense their presence pressed into a narrow gap between stacked cotton bales. To his left, Samuel wedged beneath a crate reinforced with metal bands. Clara curled into the hollow formed by a row of water barrels. Moses sitting with his head bowed forward where the shadows gathered beneath the sloping deck, and nearly 24 others hidden in similarly impossible positions. They were scattered throughout the hold like ghosts tucked into the skeleton of a vessel, built to carry the prophets of human misery. For a time, no one moved, no one dared. Even the smallest sound could echo between the crates. Even the slightest shift could draw the wrong kind of attention. So they waited in the suffocating hush, breathing through cloth to muffle the sound, listening to the world beyond the planks without being seen dot above them. Footsteps thudded across the deck as the guards resumed their patrol. Lantern light glowed faintly above the cracks, flickering in irregular bursts that cast dancing shadows across the darkness of the hold. Jacob could imagine the guards' faces washed in yellow light, their jaws slack with fatigue, their eyes scanning lazily but not truly seeing. The plantation's daily rhythms had taught the guards which threats were real and which were unthinkable, and the idea that enslaved individuals might be hidden just beneath their boots on a night like this was something they would never consider. Jacob relied on that blindness. He relied on their arrogance, their belief in control, their casual underestimation of the human beings whose labor built their wealth. But he also knew the arrogance was unpredictable. Sometimes it made oppressors careless, but sometimes it made them cruelly attentive. Every sound from above was a reminder that their lives hung in a fragile balance. Between those two possibilities, as the minutes stretched into an hour, the guard's voices grew more subdued. One muttered about the cold, another about aching feet, and a third complained bitterly about the mosquitoes that seemed to favor his skin. Their conversation drifted toward jokes made at the expense of the enslaved workers, laughter thick and empty, the kind of laughter that sharpened Jacob's resolve rather than weakening it. He listened in silence, letting their words wash over him without internalizing the cruelty. He had long ago learned that to survive mentally, he had to separate the captor's voice from the truth of his own worth. But even as he hardened himself against the voices drifting through the planks, he wondered whether any of the children hiding in the hold were listening to those same words. With fresh wounds, escape required physical movement, but freedom required healing from scars that ran far deeper. Eventually, the guard's conversation faded, replaced by the distant rustling of leaves and the slow lull of river water. The lantern light dimmed further as the oil inside began to burn low. Jacob counted each shift of light, estimating how much longer it would take before the flame weakened enough to make the guards less vigilant. He had trained himself to measure time not by clocks, but by habits. How long men stayed awake before boredom overtook them. How long it took a lantern to go from bright glow to faint ember. How long silence lingered before exhaustion dulled suspicion. What he could not anticipate, however, was the way humidity thickened the air inside the hold as night deepened. The closeness became almost unbearable. Sweat trickled down his neck, soaking into his shirt, and each breath felt as though it had to be pulled from heavy, stale air. Somewhere in the darkness, a child stifled a coughing fit, the muffled sound trembling like a fragile reed in the wind. Jacob's heart thundered, but the cough did not repeat. The child's self-control was extraordinary, born of desperation and fear. Time blurred into a suffocating haze as Jacob lay pressed against the wood. His muscles throbbed from holding a fixed position. His fingers, trapped beneath his chest, tingled as blood struggled to circulate. But he remained still. He thought of his mother, whose memories he carried like a quiet prayer in the back of his mind. He thought of the brother he had been separated from years ago, sold to a neighboring plantation. He wondered whether his brother would ever learn of this night, whether word of the escape, if successful, would travel through the network of enslaved communities that communicated under the shadow of darkness and fear. He wondered whether his brother was still alive. These thoughts grounded him, sharpening his determination even as pain gnawed at his limbs. Hours gradually passed. The sounds of the guard shifted again. One yawned loudly. Another shuffled near the edge of the dock to relieve himself. Another sat heavily on a wooden crate and let out a long sigh. Jacob felt their fatigue through the vibrations of the deck. He waited through each sound, his breathing time to their patterns. But then, unexpectedly, a new sound cut through the night, a metallic clink followed by a low mutter of annoyance. One of the guards had dropped a lantern hook, and when he stooped to retrieve it, the lantern shook violently, sending a streak of brighter light directly through a crack in the deck above Jacob's hiding space. For a split second, Jacob feared the guard had seen something, the brightness revealing the faint outline of motion or the glint of an eye. But the guard simply grumbled, adjusted the lantern, and resumed pacing. The moment passed, but it left Jacob's heart pounding at a frantic pace. Even a small accident could unravel everything. At some point in the deep hours of the night, when the lanterns burned low and the chorus of insects grew louder than the human voices, the river began to shift. Jacob felt the change before he heard it. The current swelled, pushing harder against the hull, making the boat sway more noticeably. It was the kind of movement that could wake a sleeping person or unsettle a nervous one. But the guards were used to the river's restlessness. They dismissed the rocking as ordinary and allowed their vigilance to lapse further. Their movements slowed, footsteps dragging, speech slurred with fatigue. One guard even drifted into a shallow sleep, his breathing heavy enough that Jacob could hear it through the creaking wood. When the final lantern flickered into near darkness, Jacob recognized the moment he had been waiting for. They had to remain hidden until dawn's approach. But this window, this fragile interval of deep night, was when their risk of detection was lowest. It was also when the dangers inside the hold became most pronounced. People who had been silently contorted for hours began to feel the full force of fatigue. Numbness set into limbs, cramps twisted muscles, and the pounding heat became its own form of torment. Someone shifted involuntarily, the faint scrape of fabric against wood reaching Jacob's ears like a thunderclap. His pulse surged, but the guards did not react. Another person took a slow, trembling breath that nearly turned into a gasp before being muffled by sheer will. Jacob wished he could speak to them, reassure them, guide them through the silent suffering. But any sound would be too dangerous. All he could do was trust the strength that had brought them this far. As the darkest hours pressed on, the hold became a space suspended outside ordinary time. Jacob drifted in and out of a half-conscious state, his mind flickering through memories like small lanterns lighting the shadows of his past. He saw the face of the older man who had once taught him how to tie knots on the river boats. He saw the worn hands of the woman who had taught enslaved children to read in secret by drawing letters in dirt behind the smokehouse. He saw a younger version of himself standing on the river bank, watching the sun rise over the water with the knowledge that every day would be shaped by someone else's commands. These memories fused with the present moment, shaping his resolve into something harder than fear, stronger than pain. He checked the panel beside him with steady fingers, ensuring it remained secure. Even the smallest deviation could let in light or let out sound. The hours stretched, sweat trickled, muscles cramped, breath tightened. But dawn remained just a distant promise. And then, sometime after midnight, a new sound pierced the stillness. A distant shout carried across the river from another property. The guards above stirred, jolted awake by the noise. Jacob's body tensed, every muscle rigid. The shout came again, sharper this time, followed by the barking of dogs. The guards leaned over the railings, peering across the dark water. Their voices overlapped in confusion as they tried to interpret the disturbance. A farmhand on the opposite bank must have startled wildlife or encountered trouble. But the sound was enough to reignite the guards' suspicion. For several tense minutes, they scanned the shoreline and walked the deck with renewed vigilance. At one point, one guard stomped hard on the boards above Jacob's hiding place, testing for loose planks. Jacob held his breath until stars sparked at the edges of his vision, praying the panel would not give way. The guard paused, then continued walking. Relief flooded Jacob's chest like cool water, but he did not allow himself to relax. The night was far from over. Eventually the river settled again. The distant shouts faded, the dogs quieted, and the guard's vigilance ebbed once more. The lantern, nearly drained of oil, sputtered weakly before dimming into a faint orange ember. Jacob exhaled silently. The danger had passed, but the cost of those agonizing minutes lingered in his trembling muscles. As the long night dragged toward its final hours, Jacob sensed a subtle shift in the air. The temperature dropped slightly, and the darkness outside the cracks changed toneless black. More blue. Dawn was approaching. Soon the pilot would arrive to prepare the flatboat for departure. Soon the guards would rouse fully. Soon the cargo would begin to shift as men boarded, and soon the boat heavy with bodies hidden between the crates would push off from the dock and slip into the vast sweep of the Mississippi River. The journey had barely begun. Yet already the river was reminding them that freedom flowed on the edge of peril. The river carried them forward, but the weight of the world pressed down on the flatboat as if the Mississippi itself were trying to reclaim what had escaped its shores. Jacob knew that every mile south could mean discovery, but every mile across the river system also opened paths north and into the deep, tangled heart of territories where slave catchers were less certain of their authority. After the failed betrayal and the violent confrontation that followed, he felt the need for absolute stillness in his thoughts, even as danger vibrated around them like a fever. The night air felt thick with dualities: freedom and captivity, hope and despair, faith and fear. Yet the oars dipped softly, rhythmically, because movement was the only truth left to them. The faces of those rescued glowed faintly in the starlight, lined with exhaustion and streaked with river spray, but also lit with something else, a fragile but unmistakable flicker that could only be called possibility. It was something few had ever known long enough to recognize. Jacob scanned the horizon constantly, eyes measuring distance, tree line spacing, current shift, moon reflection, any detail that could signal pursuit. His voice stayed low, his movements controlled, the discipline of someone who had lived years holding his breath through unspeakable things. The river knew all their secrets now. It was carrying their footsteps, their cries, their hopes, their fear, and the truth of what had been risked. There was no turning back. The water had already erased the path behind them. The journey into the next phase required more than silence. It needed strategy. Jacob had spent years gathering whispered knowledge from rivermen, free black stevedores, abolitionist sympathizers hidden within river ports, and even from certain enslaved laborers forced to ferry goods up and down the tributaries. He knew which sandbars created misleading illusions of shallow water, which marshes concealed routes used by indigenous nations, and which inlets offered brief safety from patrol boats. As dawn approached, he steered the boat into a westward channel largely abandoned early in the season, because its current shifted unpredictably. To Jacob, unpredictability was a shield. Slave catchers preferred familiarity. They knew the main arteries and watched them intensely. But the river held countless veins, narrow, twisting, overgrown, invisible from even a few yards away, where the unwatched could move through the cracks of the system. The rescue party moved into one such artery, pushing between curtains of hanging moss that brushed their faces as they passed. The sound softened. Bird calls replaced shouts. Wind replaced warning bells. The world grew quieter until it felt as if they were slipping through the folds of an old memory. Unseen and unjudged, the exhaustion of the past nights began to reveal itself, slow, aching, creeping into muscles and minds. Children slept in the arms of elders who themselves fought sleep, as though resting could bring danger closer. The women who had carried wounds from the escape leaned against each other, their breaths shallow, bodies still trembling from shock. One of the older men, who had been whipped only days earlier, drifted in and out of consciousness, whispering fragments of scripture and field hymns tangled with fever. Jacob knew they needed proper rest, water from a clean source, and cover from aerial sightlines. But stopping was a gamble. Every pause could create opportunities for trackers to close gaps. Every hour stationary was an hour where the world moved around them, and not always in their favor. Still, he recognized that continuing without pause would shatter the weakest among them, and Jacob had sworn silently, fiercely, that if he was to lead people to freedom, he would not do it at the cost of those who could not keep pace. Liberation meant nothing if the frail were abandoned. By mid-morning, he found a small marsh island hidden by leaning cypress trees whose roots rose from the water, like knotted pillars. Spanish moss draped over the branches in heavy curtains, and thick underbrush shielded the view from the river. It was the kind of place overlooked by anyone who had never spent years Studying the secret geography of survival, Jacob guided the flatboat into the darkest part of the shade and motioned for everyone to step onto the soft, spongy ground. The earth swallowed their footsteps. No trace would remain once they moved on. The moment the group set foot on solid land, relief blended with the fragility of their situation. Some collapsed immediately, lying down without removing their shoes. Others surveyed the area with wide, uncertain eyes, as though afraid rest might be a trap. Jacob moved through them quietly, checking wounds, distributing the limited food they had, mostly cornmeal, dried fish, and a handful of apples. The pregnant woman needed the most care. She had survived the escape, but her breathing had become shallow and her steps unsteady. Jacob knelt beside her, feeling her pulse and whispering the reassurance he could not fully believe. Any complication now could be fatal. He thought of midwives, of hidden free settlements, of anyone who could help, but they were too far from such places still. All he could offer her was time, shade, and hope. Fear worked differently on each of them. Some trembled at every sound, convinced patrols lurked behind every tree. Others stared out at the water in disbelief, as though freedom tasted too sharp to trust. A few felt a rising guilt for those left behind, siblings, spouses, friends whose chains still rattled on the plantations behind them. These mixed emotions simmered in the air like heat rising from cracked ground. Jacob felt it all pressing against him, their grief, their terror, their longing. Leadership did not mean power. It meant burden. Every life here now sat on his decisions. And so he sat at the edge of the marsh, scanning the horizon for any movement. But his mind drifted back to the plantation, to the bodies he had seen dragged away, to the fact that blood had been spilled. Even if they made it north, the violence of that night would echo through Mississippi's slave economy. Retaliations would erupt. Other enslaved people would suffer because their masters feared rebellion. Jacob carried that knowledge like iron lodged behind his ribs. Freedom was never isolated. It always cost something. It always left scars somewhere else. By late afternoon, the air thickened into a heavy heat that clung to their skin. The island became a cocoon where time seemed to stretch thin, offering rest, but also amplifying the awareness that danger had not vanished. The children were the first to wake and wander, poking sticks into the water, whispering to frogs, collecting fallen leaves. Their innocence felt like blasphemy and blessing together. In a world forged by cruelty, children still found ways to marvel. Jacob watched them from a distance, trying to understand what future life he was truly guiding them toward. Free states still held prejudice. The North still bore the stains of racism and laws meant to placate Southern slaveholders. Freedom was not safety. It was only the first breath after drowning. It was only the first breath after drowning. As evening neared, Jacob called the group together in the only way he could, by presence, by the slow gathering of bodies who instinctively looked to him. He spoke softly, explaining the plan for the night. They would travel again under cover of darkness, aiming to reach a meeting point along a tributary where a free black fisherman was rumored to assist escapees. Jacob had never met the man directly, but stories of him circulated quietly among abolitionist circles along the river. The man would not wait long. Trust in these parts never extended past the turning of the moon. They needed to move soon. The group listened in weighted silence, each processing what it meant to leave their brief shelter. Their legs still ached, their hearts still pounded with memories of gunshots and shouts. But rest had done as much as it could. The river called them back. Night fell thick and fast, wrapping the island in deep blue shadows. The cicadas roared around them like a warning or a blessing. It was hard to tell. Jacob led them back to the flatboat, helping the older and the injured step aboard. The water felt cooler now, as though the river itself had shed its aggression and settled into a contemplative calm. Once everyone was seated, Jacob pushed away from the marsh, guiding the boat slowly through narrow channels where the branches nearly scraped their cheeks. The moon rose, its reflection rippling across the water like a guiding lantern. The sounds of pursuit were far behind them, but the memory lingered in every sharp breath, every twitch at sudden noises, every backward glance. As the night deepened, Jacob steered them toward a fork in the river barely visible without trained eyes. The channel was narrow, almost unnavigable, but it led toward the rumored meeting point. Vines brushed the sides of the boat and mosquitoes swarmed, but no lantern light or paddle stroke from pursuers echoed through the dark. Hours passed with only the rhythmic gulp of water against wood and the occasional murmur from someone dreaming uneasily. Jacob felt a strange mix of exhaustion and alertness. Fatigue pressed down on him, yet his senses remained sharpened by responsibility. He wondered how many more nights like this it would take before they reached true sanctuary. He wondered if sanctuary even existed in a country where human beings could be hunted for profit. Near midnight, a faint smell of smoke drifted toward them. It was subtle, but unmistakable, a sign of a nearby settlement, or a camp, or perhaps the fishermen's hidden outpost. Jacob slowed his paddling, straining his eyes for any movement ahead. The group grew tense, sensing the shift in his body. The smoke thickened slightly, becoming more distinct, almost like pine wood burning slowly. He knew they were close. Whether to refuge or new danger, he could not yet tell. But the next stretch of river would determine everything. The boat glided forward, silent except for the tremor in everyone's breath. As they approached the source of the smoke and scene, waiting, shaping the next turn of their fate. Asterisk, the smoke grew stronger as the flatboat drifted deeper into the tributary, a thin gray ribbon hovering just above the treetops like a silent signal. Jacob felt every muscle in his back tighten as he studied the glow ahead, orange, faint, pulsing through the dense wall of cypress trunks. Fire could mean refuge, but it could just as easily mean danger. Slave catchers sometimes lit small campfires near water routes. Knowing runaways often approached cautiously, searching for clues. Yet the fire's position seemed tucked to low, too hidden to be a deliberate trap. It looked like survival contained, careful, meant for warmth or simple cooking, not for visibility. Jacob guided the oars with the patience of someone who understood that hope. And ruin often shared the same shadow. The others sensed it too. Their bodies leaned forward slightly, breaths held, as if the river had suddenly become a tightrope stretched over an abyss. The pregnant woman clutched the side of the boat with trembling fingers. A child pressed his face into his mother's arm. Every heartbeat sounded louder in the quiet night as they neared the bend. Jacob motioned for everyone to lower themselves, to make their silhouettes vanish beneath the rim of the boat. He slowed their movement until the current alone pulled them forward. When the bow finally slipped past the last curve, the hidden camp revealed itself, a small clearing on the bank, shielded on all sides by tall reeds, where a single lean figure sat beside a modest fire. The man's posture was relaxed yet sharp, like someone accustomed to watching the world without being watched. A battered skiff lay pulled halfway onto the bank, and a stack of fishing baskets glistened faintly in the firelight. Jacob recognized signs that matched the whispers he'd followed for months. This was either the fisherman who risked his life quietly for those fleeing bondage, or a mimic capable of ending everything. Trust was always a gamble, but in 1838 Mississippi, trust from a stranger could be deadlier than any chain. Still, they had come too far to retreat blindly into the darkness. Jacob steadied himself, letting the silence linger until the fisherman finally lifted his gaze toward the water. His eyes reflected firelight, but also something older, tired, deliberate, and unfearful. A man who lived beneath the notice of the world but saw everything clearly. The fisherman stood slowly, as though measuring the weight of the scene before him. Jacob felt the group tremble behind him, their fear pressing into his spine. But something in the man's stance, his calm, his lack of sudden movement, felt like a quiet invitation. Jacob eased the boat toward the shore, careful, respectful, prepared for anything. The boat scraped gently against the mud. The man extinguished part of his fire with a handful of wet soil, leaving only embers glowing like scattered stars on the ground. It was a gesture Jacob noticed immediately, making the camp less visible to distant eyes. That was not the act of a predator. That was the act of someone who understood pursuit. When the fisherman stepped forward into the moonlight, Jacob saw the truth of him carved into the lines of his face. He was older than expected, perhaps in his late 50s, with deep brown skin weathered by wind and river spray. His clothes were patched, but sturdy, and his movements bore the confidence of someone who had spent more years on water than land. Jacob sensed no hostility. Instead, he sensed a shared burden, one carried by men who risked themselves not for glory, but because their conscience demanded it. Without saying a word, the fisherman lifted one hand slowly and pointed toward the shadows deeper within the reeds. He then stepped back, giving Jacob space to choose. It was not guidance, not command, more like a signal that safety, or at least temporary invisibility, lay beyond the thicket. Jacob nodded slightly and began helping the others step onto the bank. The ground was cool and soft beneath their feet, and the reeds shielded them from the open river like a living wall. The fisherman gestured again, this time toward a cluster of overturned baskets ranged deliberately to form a blind spot, a place to huddle low, unseen, while he prepared something unknown. Jacob guided the group into this sheltered space, then stepped out to face the fisherman. The older man studied him, as if scanning him for the truth of who he was, not just what danger he carried, but what purpose drove him. In that silent exchange, something unspoken was agreed upon. The fisherman turned toward his skiff and began uncovering bundles hidden beneath its tarp, cloth, dried food, small tools, and what looked like a folded birch bark map. It became clear that he had been waiting not for them specifically, but for someone like them, for those who needed to slip through the cracks of an empire built on their captivity. Jacob felt the weight on his chest ease slightly for the first time in days. This man was not a trap. He was a lifeline. As the fisherman worked, Jacob assessed the camp more fully. No tracks, no sign of recent visitors, no spare equipment that didn't belong to one person. This was the base of a solitary guardian, someone who helped without expecting anything in return. Such people existed in Mississippi's shadow corners, free black men who used their mobility to carve hidden routes across the river lands, indigenous guides who remembered old trails untouched by American maps, poor white fishermen who despised slave patrols more than they feared slaveholders. Their names rarely survived history, but their work shaped the fragile pathways through which hundreds escaped bondage. Jacob knew he had found one of these unsung figures. The fisherman's quiet efficiency was its own form of testimony. The older man finally stood, motioned Jacob closer, and opened the birch bark map. It showed the tributary system stretching northward like a web of dark veins. Certain channels were marked with subtle notches, likely safe passages or points where patrols rarely ventured. Jacob studied it carefully, committing each fork and bend to memory, because maps could be lost. But memory had saved him too many times to abandon it now. What struck him most were the faint charcoal circles marking places where the fishermen had helped others. There were many, dozens, perhaps more. Jacob realized they were not alone in this struggle. The river had been carrying quiet rebellions for years, even if the newspapers and plantation ledgers never recorded them. He felt a surge of gratitude that he immediately suppressed. Gratitude was dangerous in a world where promises could die within hours. The fisherman folded the map and tucked it into Jacob's hands with a slow, deliberate press. It was a gift of trust, a compass carved from sacrifice. A compass carved from sacrifice. After ensuring their hiding place was secure, the fishermen distributed food: smoked catfish, strips of venison, and a small pouch of nuts. For some, it was the first real meal in days. The children devoured their portions like starving creatures, crumbs clinging to their cheeks. The older woman, who had nearly collapsed earlier, ate slowly, savoring every bite as though each carried a blessing. The pregnant woman managed only a few mouthfuls before leaning back, clutching her belly with a sharp expression that frightened Jacob. Her condition was worsening. He glanced at the fisherman with urgent eyes, and the older man nodded solemnly. Without words, he walked to the back of his skiff and retrieved a small bundle of herbs and dried roots, medicine of the river, passed down through families and communities that mainstream society never recognized. Jacob helped prepare a small infusion using water from a clean jug the fishermen had kept sealed. It was all they could do. They prayed silently that it would be enough. As the group settled within the reeds, Jacob returned to the fisherman's side. The two men stood facing the river, both knowing this respite was temporary. The fisherman picked up a piece of driftwood and drew a line in the mud, then pointed to the horizon. The message was clear. Patrols were closing in from downstream. They had perhaps 2 hours, 3 at most, before the danger spilled into this area. Jacob felt his chest tighten again, the brief moment of relief dissolving into the cold reality of pursuit. But he also felt renewed purpose. With the map, the food, and the fisherman's guidance, they had a chance, a fragile thread, but stronger than anything they'd carried before. When it was time to go, the fishermen helped them load the flatboat, slipping additional tools under the seats: a flint, a coiled rope, and a small knife wrapped in cloth. He whispered nothing, but his actions spoke a language older than words, the language of solidarity born in the shadow of oppression. The group bowed their heads toward him, some mouthing silent blessings, others merely staring with tears that would not fall. Jacob gripped the fisherman's hand in a firm, silent clasp. Two men bound not by blood, but by the shared knowledge that freedom was a collective act, carried out in fragments, in whispers, in the darkness of river crossings no one recorded. As they pushed away from the bank, the embers of the fisherman's fire glowed faintly, shrinking into the distance until they looked like a dying star collapsing into night. The river opened before them again, dark and winding, indifferent yet filled with possibility. Jacob set his jaw, planted his feet, and began rowing deeper into the intricate web of channels that would determine whether this Escape became legend or tragedy. Behind him, the group clung to hope made from smoke, river water, and the courage of strangers. Ahead of them lay the narrow corridors of survival, northern routes, hidden marshlands, secret settlements, and the ever-present threat of capture. But for the first time since fleeing the plantation, Jacob felt something steady rising inside him, like a pulse aligning with the current. Not safety, not certainty, but direction. And direction, in their world, was the first true taste of freedom. The river became a darker, narrower world as the night stretched into its coldest hours, forcing Jacob and the others into a silence so complete that even their breathing felt like trespass. The tributaries here were wild and tamed ribbons weaving through forests, where human footsteps rarely pressed the soil. Branches leaned low, skimming the surface, and roots rose like knuckles from beneath the water, threatening to catch the flatboat with every pass. Yet Jacob moved with a calm sharpened by desperation, each stroke of the oar deliberate, measured, shaped by the memory of the fisherman's map now folded against his chest. The moon shifted behind clouds, leaving them to navigate by instinct and the faint whisper of the current. Behind him, the group huddled under blankets the fishermen had given them, their silhouettes small against the night. But though the river hid them well, Jacob knew danger did not need light to find them. Patrols could track by scent, by rumor, by the simple pattern of where fugitives might run. He imagined riders spreading out from plantations, men with dogs trained to pick up fear as easily as sweat. Every bend in the water felt like a question. Had the hunters chosen this route too? As the hours crawled forward, fatigue clawed into Jacob's bones. His arms burned, his hands blistered, and his mind flickered between focus and the haunting memories of the plantation night. Every time he blinked along, he saw bodies dragged across dirt, saw firelight glinting off shackles, saw the moment when escape and death had stood so close they nearly touched. But he forced himself awake, gripping the oar tighter, because every soul on the boat had placed their future inside his trembling hands. A soft wind drifted over the water, carrying scents of pine and distant damp earth. It was a gentler smell than the heavy rot of the lower Mississippi, and Jacob sensed they were moving into territory where plantations thinned, and the wilderness reclaimed power. Still, civilization lingered somewhere in the dark settlers' cabins, logging camps, militia posts. The land was quieter, but not emptied out by dawn. A muted gray stretched across the sky, revealing a landscape wrapped in morning mist. The water looked like a sheet of dull metal, and Jacob guided the boat into a shadowed nook beneath overhanging branches. They needed rest and concealment before light betrayed them. Once anchored, the group lay sprawled across the boat's floor, some drifting into shallow sleep, others whispering prayers or memories too soft to decipher. The pregnant woman's breathing had steadied somewhat, though she clutched her belly with an expression caught between hope and dread. Jacob knew childbirth under these conditions was not simply difficult, it was perilous. He calculated distances in his head. How long until they reached the next rumored safe clearing? How far from any settlement with midwives who might help without betraying them? Every possibility felt razor thin, but he could not speak these fears aloud. Leadership demanded a mass thick enough to hold everyone else's breaking points. The rising daylight revealed the full complexity of the terrain. They were deep within a floodplain forest, a labyrinth of cypress knees, drifting logs, and narrow waterways that twisted unpredictably. Birds cried overhead, their calls echoing through the canopy with an eerie resonance. Jacob scanned the area for footprints or signs of human presence, but only animal tracks patterned the muddy banks. No boot prints, no wagon ruts. This place belonged more to wildlife than to men, and that fact gave him a sliver of comfort. The more inhospitable the terrain, the less likely slave catchers would risk chasing runaways through it. Still, Jacob would not allow himself to grow complacent. Danger was a patient predator. It waited for mistakes. As the sun climbed, the heat thickened, and the air turned heavy enough to feel like wet cloth pressed against the skin. Flies swarmed, mosquitoes descended in relentless clouds, and the group stirred uneasily. A child let out a soft whimper as an insect bit his cheek, and his mother pulled him close, wiping sweat gently from his brow. Another man fanned the pregnant woman with a torn piece of cloth. Their silence now felt less like fear and more like collective endurance. For years they had survived under crushing brutality. This stretch of river, harsh as it was, still offered something the plantations never did: choice. Even in exhaustion, that realization shimmered between them like a thin thread of light. Jacob left the boat briefly, stepping onto a patch of mud-shrouded land to scout ahead. His boots sank with each step, and the wet ground made soft sucking sounds, but he moved quietly, Trained by years of hiding his footsteps, he pushed through underbrush, following a faint animal trail. After a few minutes, he found a thicker stretch of tree cover and a small pool fed by groundwater clear enough to refill their jugs. He dipped his hand into the water, cold and refreshing, then listened carefully. No human voices, no dogs, only the distant croak of frogs and the rustle of leaves shifting against the morning breeze. He filled the jugs quickly and returned to the group, offering water to each person before drinking any himself. His hands trembled slightly from fatigue, but he masked it beneath steady motions as midday neared. They were forced to move again. The sun's climb meant the mist had evaporated, and their hiding place no longer blended into the landscape. Jacob signaled for everyone to shift their weight as he untied the boat. The pregnant woman winced sharply, pressing her hand over her abdomen. Jacob felt his heartbeat spike. They had hours, maybe less, before her condition turned critical. The urgency sharpened his movements. He paddled with new intensity, steering the boat northward, deeper into the twisting networks of waterways that the fishermen had marked on his map. Each fork approached too quickly, each current change demanded precision, and Jacob felt the map burning like a brand against his chest. He followed memory, instinct, and the subtle hints the older man had folded into the charcoal lines of the parchment. The river stretched into long, winding corridors where the trees grew closer, their branches forming archways overhead. Light filtered through in broken beams, making the water shimmer with fractured gold. In another life, this place could have been beautiful, but beauty held little comfort for a group whose shadows could betray them. They moved with a solemn focus, scanning the banks for danger. Once, they glimpsed a cluster of deer drinking at the water's edge. The animals froze, ears raised, then bounded silently into the woods. Their sudden flight tightened everyone's chest. Deer did not run unless something was near. Jacob slowed the boat and listened, but after minutes of tension, nothing stirred. Perhaps the animals had only scented the unfamiliar presence of humans. Still, the moment carved a warning into Jacob's nerves. Hours passed. Each waited with the knowledge that they were threading the gap between salvation and catastrophe. The pregnant woman began to moan softly, her pain deepening. One of the older women moved to her side, rubbing her back with slow, practiced motions learned in slave cabins where childbirth was both sacred and perilous. The moans sharpened, then quieted, then returned in waves. Jacob's jaw clenched. They needed shelter, real shelter, not a patch of reeds or a sliver of marsh. They needed a dry bank, enough wood to build a fire, enough cover to hide smoke. But in this wilderness, such places were rare. The swamp gave shelter, but it also gave sickness. He measured every tree cluster, every bank curve, searching for something that resembled safety. Late afternoon light dimmed into amber when he finally found it, a stretch of raised ground, covered in thick vegetation, wide enough to hold the group and tall enough that smoke, if kept low, might disperse into the canopy unnoticed. It was the first terrain in hours that felt like sanctuary. Jacob guided the boat toward it, grounding the bow on firm soil. As everyone clambered ashore, the pregnant woman nearly collapsed. Her labor had begun. Sharp panic flared through the group, but they moved quickly, gathering leaves, clearing a space, creating what little comfort they could. The older woman took charge, kneeling beside the soon-to-be mother with a steady composure born from years of delivering babies. In darkness, under threat, under oppression, even in the forest, even in flight, the rituals of life refused to surrender. Jacob paced the perimeter, scanning the tree line, ears tuned to every rustle. His hands shook not from fear, but from helplessness. He could fight patrols. He could face down overseers. But childbirth was a battlefield of its own, one he had no control over. He watched the sky shift into dusk, colors bleeding into deep shades of blue and violet. The forest sounds grew louder as nocturnal life awakened. Crickets chirped, owls called. The river lapped softly at the bank. Yet behind these natural rhythms, Jacob sensed a deeper tension. They were running out of time, not just for the group, but for the woman whose cries grew sharper as the hours passed. Night enveloped them completely, and the birth pains intensified. The older woman's instructions came in low murmurs, her hands firm and soothing. The others formed a loose circle, shielding the mother from the cold breeze and offering what comfort their trembling bodies could give. Jacob knelt nearby, his eyes never leaving the shadows. The sky held no stars, now only a dark expanse reflecting the uncertainty of their fate. He listened to the woman's cries, each one a reminder that life and death danced so closely in the world they fled. He prayed not with words, but with the rhythm of his breath. with a fierce hope pressing against his ribs, with a silent plea that the river had carried them far enough to allow at least this woman and her child a chance. When the moment finally came, it tore through the forest with raw power, a new cry, thin but real, rising into the night air like a fragile proclamation that life still chose to bloom. Even amid terror, a baby's wail echoed through the trees, startling birds from their branches and sending a shiver through every person present. Relief mingled with fear. A newborn's cry was a miracle, but also a beacon. Jacob's heart surged with conflicting emotions. The child lived, the mother lived, but now their urgency had multiplied. The newborn symbolized hope, but hope carried vulnerability. They could not linger. They could not risk dawn finding them here. Freedom demanded movement, and the river, patient but relentless, waited for them to continue the journey it had begun. Jacob's return upriver was unlike any journey he had taken before. The river that had once carried the sound of chains and the threat of pursuing riders now carried the soft rhythms of night insects and the distant calls of owls along the swamp edges. In those quiet waters, illuminated by a faint sliver of moonlight, he felt the weight of everything he had done and everything he had set in motion. For the first time, he traveled not with escapees, but with memories, faces of the people he had ferried to safety, voices of those whispering prayers as they crossed state borders in the dark, the trembling hands of mothers gripping his arm as they stepped onto free soil. But the journey back toward Mississippi was not a triumphant return. It was a descent into the place that had shaped him, the place whose cruelty had carved the need for courage into his bones. His boat rocked gently, and though the river seemed calm, he knew the moment word spread of the missing groups, slave catchers, deputized militiamen, and patrols would be waiting like wolves along the shore. Yet he also knew that leaving more people behind while he remained alive would haunt him far more than the danger ahead. By the time Jacob reached the first bend near Natchez, he saw the lights of torches along the banks more than usual, more organized, more intentional. Patrols had doubled. The disappearance of dozens had turned the region into a net tightening around the black population. Plantation owners, certain that a coordinated rebellion was underway, had begun interrogating enslaved people, jailing them, beating them, insisting someone must talk. The fear that gripped the white population was not simply fear of losing labor, but a deeper terror that the system they relied on, the system they defended, might be fracturing from within. Jacob kept to the deepest parts of the river, where the shadows were thickest and the waterway widened into a sprawling delta. He avoided ports and landings, rowing silently with only the sound of distant dogs breaking through the night air. He had always known that every rescue increased the risk for those still enslaved, but seeing the intensity of the patrol activity now, he felt a surge of guilt. He wondered whether he had underestimated the backlash, whether his choices had exposed more people to pain. But as he drifted closer to the inner channels, those thoughts hardened into determination. If the system responded violently to people reaching for freedom, then the fault lay in the system, not in the hands of those who dared to challenge it. Jacob moved inland under the cover of darkness, taking hidden footpaths that only the enslaved used, routes worn by generations of unrecorded footsteps. He returned first to the smaller plantations, the ones where he knew surveillance was weaker and people had overseers too lazy or arrogant to suspect the quiet movements taking place after dusk. He distributed coded messages through trusted field hands, women at the washing sheds, stable boys who could slip between barns unnoticed. But he quickly discovered how much had changed since his departure. Some plantations were filled with whispers of suspicion. Overseers watched even the slightest movement. On others, Jacob found a new kind of fear, one that made people hesitant, even when freedom was within reach. Stories had spread of dogs tearing apart escapees on the riverbanks, of patrols dragging fugitives back in chains and leaving their bodies as warnings. The reaction to the mass disappearances had become a campaign of terror designed to suffocate hope. Before it could take root again, Jacob realized he could not move in the same patterns as before. The familiar routes had been compromised, informants among whites had gone silent, and even some of the forests he once used as staging grounds now held armed patrols, waiting for signs of unusual movement. Still, the desire for freedom had a way of surviving even the harshest repression. On a large cotton estate near Bayou Pierre, Jacob found a group already planning an escape of their own, a group he had never contacted. Inspired by rumors of a man guiding people north through the river maze, they had gathered tools, food scraps, and even a crude map drawn by an enslaved carpenter who once saw a river trader's atlas. Their leader, A man named Elias had scars along his back that told the story of repeated defiance. When Jacob revealed who he was, the group did not recoil in fear, but looked at him like a figure out of whispered legend. But Jacob refused the notion that he was some kind of ghostly liberator. He told them he was simply one man, not invincible, not untouchable. He explained the risks had grown worse. Yet Elias and the others were resolute. They told him they would leave with or without him. That truth, this unstoppable hunger for freedom, reignited Jacob's purpose. He agreed to guide them, but insisted on delaying for several nights to confirm the movement of patrols near the river. This hesitation, though strategic, created tension within the group, as they knew that waiting even one day could mean someone uncovering their plan. Yet Jacob had learned enough to know impatience could be fatal.